Slide shows, or as folks call them, the freak shows, started in England during the 16th century. People with rare physical features were thrown on stage and turned into public spectacles. Back then, deformities weren't just feared. They were treated like omens or signs of something dark. That fear made people curious, and showmen like P.T. Barnum knew how to cash in. He turned human difference into entertainment. It was eploitative, but also a twisted road to fame, and sometimes money. In this video, we look at 15 circus freaks from history you've never heard of. Number 15. Freda Pushnik. People in the 1930s first saw Freda Pushnik being carried out on a velvet pillow and could hardly believe their eyes. She had been born without arms and legs, only a small stump on her left side, yet she moved with a confidence that silenced the room. Instead of being hidden away, she taught herself to put on makeup, thread a needle, crochet, solve puzzles, and even type with precision. At 10 years old, she appeared at Ripley's first Believe It or Not auditorium at the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago and stunned the crowd. Later, she toured the country and in 1943 joined Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. Her sister Irma, once a trapeze artist, worked behind the scenes at the circus office. Freda stepped away from performing in 1956, but later turned up in cult films like House of the Damned and Sideshow. She became a legend, proving to thousands that strength can grow in places where most people expect only limits. Number 14. Joe the Leopard Boy. He walked on stage covered in patches that looked like a leopard's coat, and crowds stared like they were looking at some kind of wild animal. His real name was A.E. Bishel, born in 1869, an African-American, and living with leukoderma. That condition made his skin break into scattered light patches. He was one of the earliest Leopard Boys, and P.T. Barnum gave him the costume, the label, and the cage. He worked in dime museums, small, dusty places where names were erased and stares were loud. The audience didn't ask who he was. They just watched. Over time, Joe disappeared, and the act became everything. In 1909, they say he fell through a trapdoor backstage and died. He was only 40. His skin made him visible, but it never made him seen. He lived between mirrors and stages, caught between who he was and who they wanted him to be. And when the curtain fell, all that was left was a forgotten myth. Number 13. The Last Tattooed Lady. Lorett Fulkerson, born Loretta Love back in the days of 1915, didn't care what people thought. While most women covered themselves, she let her skin speak. By the time she hit the road with Ringling Brothers, nearly 90% of her body was tattooed. She wasn't part of some underground trend. This was before tattoos were cool. For her, they weren't a rebellion. They were a full-time job. She performed under the name The Tattooed Lady, and banners promised intricate designs and bold color. She traveled non-stop with Hubert's Museum, Hall and Christ, and other sideshow circuits across America. Long after the crowd stopped gawking, Lorett kept performing. Most retired when tattoos stopped shocking the public. She didn't. She stayed in the business until the early 1990s. By then, sideshows were almost gone, but she still showed up. People called her the last of her kind. She passed in 2007 at 92, an icon who didn't chase trends like TikTokers. She made a living off her skin, and she never flinched or felt guilty. Number 12. Carrie Acres. Carrie Acres stood just over 3 feet tall and weighed more than 300 pounds. Her body made people stare, but it was her attitude that made them stay. She joined P.T. Barnum's circus in the late 1880s, billed as a fat dwarf lady. But Carrie didn't play sweet or quiet. She yelled when she felt like it. She argued. She stood her ground. And because she wouldn't shrink herself down, they gave her a name meant to shame her. The Warthog. Well, not for her looks, but for her refusal to be controlled. Most acts were supposed to amaze without speaking. Carrie broke that rule. She only lasted a few years on the circuit, but her presence never faded. People remembered the woman who didn't bend. She didn't want sympathy. She didn't care for applause. What she demanded was nothing big, but respect. In a world where silence was survival, Carrie roared. She wasn't just a performer. She was the only one not playing a part. Number 11. The Bohemian Twins. Rosa and Josefa Blazek were born in Bohemia, conjoined at the lower spine. From the very start, their lives belonged to the stage. They were shown at traveling fairs as kids, put in front of crowds before they could speak for themselves. At age 13, doctors in Paris said their separation was impossible. They didn't hide. They learned to perform. The twins played violin duets, fusing music with mystery, and toured the United States in 1893 for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. In 1910, Rosa gave birth to a boy named Franz. Whether his father truly existed or was created by promoters remains unknown. Still, the controversy kept their name alive. In 1921, they returned to the U.S. with Franz for a vaudeville tour and later settled in Chicago's Czech community. Just a year later, both sisters died from influenza, minutes apart. Their deaths were quiet, but their bond outlived them. They didn't ask to be performers, but they became legends. Number 10. Captain Fred Walters. Fred had always been a soldier. He polished his boots, pressed his uniform, and obeyed orders without complaint. When an army doctor prescribed him a nerve treatment containing silver, he took it as instructed. Slowly, his skin began to change. Not pale, not bruised, but blue. By 1891, the color would never leave. With nowhere else to go, he crossed the Atlantic and joined the American freak show circuit. The blue man on stage was still the disciplined soldier underneath, but the audience never saw that. They laughed, whispered, and pointed. The silver kept working inside him, poisoning him silently while he smiled for crowds. For more than 30 years, he toured, his skin darkening, his body weakening. The stage became his only home. In 1923, the silver reached his heart, and he died far from Britain, known only by the name pinned to his skin. Some called it art. Some called it a tragedy. It was simply a man left with no other choice. Number 9. Alexander Montar. Alexander Montar stepped onto the stage so thin he looked like a shadow. By the 1850s, he was part of P.T. Barnum's line of living skeletons, but Montar never played his act for shock. At just 54 pounds, his chest 4 inches thick, wrists thinner than a thumb, he took up a violin and played instead. No padded costumes, no illusions, only a body science couldn't explain and a melody that filled the tent. Through the 1860s, he toured steadily, a quiet figure drawing huge crowds not by theatrics, but by presence. When imitators appeared, gaunter, louder, desperate for attention, they couldn't match the stillness that made him unforgettable. He showed audiences that frailty didn't have to be grotesque. It could be graceful. He didn't chase fame. He simply stood there and held it. Montar's act wasn't just a display of a thin man. It was a lesson in dignity. Even in a body that seemed to vanish, he carried music that stayed. Number 8. Willie Popeye Ingram. Willie Ingram grew up in Decatur in the 1930s, knowing his body would never blend in. By 4, he could push his eyes nearly an inch from their sockets. It hurt. It frightened people. But it gave him a way to be seen. He joined Walter L. Wanis and Sons' traveling sideshow and went from dusty county fairs to packed carnivals. Some audiences gasped, some laughed, some turned away. Willie kept going anyway. He earned a feature in Ripley's Believe It or Not, appeared in tabloid spreads, and even played a role in the 1974 cult horror film, The Freakmaker. Behind the stage lights was a man making meaning out of what he couldn't hide. His condition drew attention, but it didn't tell his story. He performed not for glory, but to carve out a space where he wasn't ignored. He lived inside a body few understood and turned it into something people couldn't look away from, and sometimes couldn't forget. All right, guys, now let's head over to number 7, Aloria Lewis and Johanna Dickens. Aloria crawled across the Coney Island boardwalk on all fours, not because she wanted pity, but because it was part of the act. Born in Brooklyn, she had drastically underdeveloped limbs, 6 fingers on each hand, and mismatched feet, 6 toes on one, a single toe on the other. Promoters called her Turtle Girl, Walrus Girl, Pig Woman. They invented a southern backstory to make her sound exotic, even though she lived only blocks from the stage. She married twice, sometimes performing under the name Aloria Green. Johanna Dickens, a dwarf born in the 1920s, was paired with her as the Bear Girl to heighten the contrast. The two weren't related but were marketed as sisters or cousins. Together they embodied the mix of cruelty and fascination that sold tickets in the sideshow era. They were real women forced into fantasy roles. Audiences came for the spectacle, but what endured was their stubborn presence in a world built on exploitation. Number 6, the Serpent Girl. A woman bent her body until her spine curled like a question mark, and the crowd fell silent. That was Serpentina, the so-called girl with no bones. Maybe her real name was Irene Farrell, or maybe not, but she was real. By the early 1900s, her identity had already been swallowed by posters. She twisted her arms behind her back, folded herself in half, and let her joints bend farther than anyone thought possible. They said she couldn't walk and had to be carried to the stage. Early shows took place in places like Oakland's Globe Cafe. Later, she toured with the Marine Hippodrome as a Sea Tiny, and by the 1940s, Ripley's picked her up. The photos were staged. The legends were louder than the truth. But she still pulled it off. She didn't need words. She moved and people stopped breathing. Maybe she was a contortionist. Maybe she was something rarer. Either way, nobody walked out of the tent without remembering her. Number 5, Johan Peterson. Johan had a normal childhood until 15. That's when his body began stretching beyond every expectation. He kept growing until he reached 7 feet 8 inches, though he often claimed even more. In 1934, he moved to Denmark and joined Europe's sideshow scene, frequently paired with dwarves to enhance the contrast. During World War II, he became stranded in Copenhagen and worked in a shipyard throughout the war. In 1948, Johan moved to the U.S. and joined the Ringling Brothers sideshow. He started with a top hat and tuxedo, but later embraced Viking garb, performing as the Viking Giant. The act made him money enough to retire comfortably. In 1950, he appeared in the film Prehistoric Women. He settled in Gibsonton, Florida in the 60s, occasionally returning for special appearances, including one at the Smithsonian in 1973. He died in 1984, not from any grand condition, but from something as common and cruel as a fall. Number 4, Sandra Reed. Sandra Reed never asked for pity. She built a legacy. Born with albinism, she turned it into something bold. At 24, she joined James E. Straight's shows in 1969, first giving lectures on albinism. But she didn't stop there. Under showman Whitney Sutton's encouragement, and later trained by Ricky Ricciardi in Gibsonton, Florida, she learned sword swallowing, one of the rarest arts, especially for women. Her entire family stood behind her. Her sister Doreen, also albino, gave lectures. Her father sold tickets. Her mother worked backstage. Sandra climbed from lectures to center stage, eventually joining Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. In the mid-70s, she married Harold Big Jim Spohn, a sideshow legend known as the Fat Man. Between 1975 and 1977, she held the Guinness World Record for most swords swallowed by a woman, 5 at once. Sandra wasn't a novelty act. She was a headliner. She turned something people whispered about into something unforgettable, and she carved her name into sideshow history. Number 3. Betty Lou Williams. Lou didn't just survive the freak show world, she took control of it. Born in 1932 with a parasitic twin, she had a head embedded in her abdomen, along with partial arms and legs growing from her torso. Her family struggled to feed 12 kids on a farm, so by age 1, she was being exhibited. At 2, Ripley picked her up, and her career exploded. As a child, she earned $250 a week when most families lived on $30. By adulthood, she was making over $1,000 a week. But she didn't waste a cent. She bought her parents a 260-acre ranch and paid for all 11 siblings to go to college. She turned what others might call a burden into an opportunity. Lou didn't want pity. She didn't seek permission. She rewrote the rules for what her life could be. In a world that tried to profit from her difference, she used that very difference to lift everyone around her. Number 2. Anne E. Leake. Anne was born to a wealthy Georgia farmer without arms, but with great patience, brilliance, and grit. She was privately educated, deeply religious, and determined to master what society assumed she couldn't. She played piano with her feet, sewed, embroidered, and even braided hair with her toes. One of her pillows read, "Where hands are lacking, toes will do." After the Civil War ruined her family's finances, Anne entered the circus, not for fame, but survival. She joined P.T. Barnum's American Museum in the 1860s, toured with Cooper and Bailey, and eventually performed in Australia with Barnum and Bailey from 1876 to 1878. In 1871, she typed her autobiography entirely with her toes. She later married steamship engineer Thompson. Though no official death record exists, a photo from 1900 shows her older, scissors in her foot, face still proud. Anne wasn't a sideshow act. She was a living contradiction to every limit placed on her. Number 1. Angus McKascal. Angus didn't walk into a room, he filled it. Born in 1825 in Scotland, he moved to Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, where his real story began. At 15, a sudden growth spurt turned him into a legend. He stood 7 feet 9 inches, weighed 425 pounds, and had hands a foot wide. His boots were 18 inches long. But unlike many giants, Angus had no health conditions, just pure natural strength. He hoisted 2,000-pound anchors, pulled fully loaded wagons, and made brawny men look like children. In 1849, P.T. Barnum paired him with Tom Thumb, the tallest and the smallest. Crowds gasped as Tom Thumb stood in Angus's palm or vanished inside his coat. Though he wasn't fond of the spotlight, Angus became a global phenomenon. He died in 1863 at just 38, leaving behind a story of unmatched strength wrapped in quiet humility. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Thanks for hanging with us. We'll see you soon.